So I have to stall for a couple of minutes because now the live stream dictates everything we do. Yes, sir.
I have a question. What is Psalm? Can you give an explanation of Psalm tap?
Psalm tap, yes. So the reason I picked that name was because of multiple meanings. So the first thing was just like the way that you would tap a beer or tap into a spring. It's like a source. So not exclusively discussing Psalms, but the Psalms being the source of everything that we're talking about. Also, the tap root of a tree, where there's kind of a central root and then other things shooting out from that. Also, tap is like, when you're conducting music, you're keeping time. There's kind of a musical connotation for tap. So, as someone who likes to write poetry, that all of that appealed to me. And there's kind of a surplus of Latin names in my circles, and so I wanted something that was not Latin at all. Although, is psalmist Latin? Are you going to correct me?
No. I was just going to say you didn't mention tap dance, and that needs
There you go. We should have a liturgical tap dance. Our next speaker is going to be Mr. Donald P. Owens II, who spoke last year, if anyone remembers him. Donald has been writing poetry from a young age, and his versifications of psalms and perhaps hymns as well, just psalms. They've been published in several psalters, including the Cantus Christi 2020, the big gray one. He's pastored a church in New York for 9 years, during which time he introduced the congregation to psalm singing. He's an apologist for the English language and likes versifying the psalms, contrary to what some people like to do. And so I hope there's going to be a little bit of a fight here about whether or not we should rhyme the psalms. But he's also an apologist for singing the psalms well, which I think is something we can all agree on, for sure. So please welcome Mr. Donald Owens. So if you could stick that in your pocket and just clip it to your shirt, just about here.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I love things like this because I don't know everything I would like to know, and a lot of the people that I would like to learn more from are here. So this is a great opportunity. Anything I say is open to dialogue, open to discussion. I like to have these sort of conversational events. I'm not going to jump on the computer right away, so you can just enjoy this picture from our trip out to the Grand Canyon about a couple weeks ago with my daughter and my wife. We found this little plaque here. Actually, has interesting history. It was taken down by the ACLU. It had been donated by the nuns back in, I think, 1960. But then the court changed its mind and it went back up. So it's good to see it there. There's something rewarding about studying Scripture and seeing things and chasing them out and getting your thoughts written down and comparing Scripture with Scripture and feeling like you're coming up with something good, something profound, and then reading and running across the works of well-known author and finding that he saw the same thing. You're not just out in left field, that what you're seeing other people have seen. At the same time, there's something quite disheartening in realizing that he said the same thing at the last Psalm tap. So my first point will be a little bit shorter than it would have been once I realized that. But review may be helpful, and if I forgot, maybe others have too. And I'd like to build on this idea of our music as sacrifice. 1 Peter 2:5 says, "You also as living stones are being built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood," so temple and the priesthood. Pretty exciting. I mean, stopping right there, if you know about the temple and the priesthood, that should be a pretty exciting idea. And after what we just heard, we shouldn't be ashamed to get excited, even if we're Presbyterian or... There's something terrifying about it. There's something daunting about it. What are the spiritual sacrifices, though? Moving on. We are a spiritual house, holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Well, there are a lot of answers to that question, but moving to along this train of thought, Hebrews 13, 15 and 16 names two. Offer the sacrifice of praise to God, that is, the fruit of our lips, giving thanks to his name. And then in the next verse, do good and share. And he concludes that section with these sacrifices. God is well pleased. God is well pleased with these practical doing good and share kind of sacrifice. And with the offering of a sacrifice of praise to God, the fruit of our lips, giving thanks to his name. This is a sacrifice that we offer to God. This idea that praise to God, that giving thanks to God's name is offering of spiritual sacrifice, it's not an innovation of the writer of Hebrews. And I don't think that it was a revelation to much of his audience. I'm sure everyone in the room is familiar with how this can be traced through Scripture. This is arguably the origin and purpose of the Psalter, to provide Israel with their tools for liturgical sacrifice. Psalm 69 even goes so far as to say, I will praise the name of God with a song and will magnify him with thanksgiving. This also shall please the Lord better than an ox or bullock that hath horns and hooves. So there it is. The animal sacrifice was the inferior shadow of a greater reality. Not only the greater reality, which is Christ, but the offering up of heartfelt praise and thanksgiving was what it was leading toward, was what it was illustrating, and is what we're called to do. So it's from the lesser to the greater. When we come to discuss what we're discussing this in the Psalm Tap, we're discussing something very, very important, something very, very central to the church's call and to the kingdom of God. Now, there's an intriguing little phrase in Hosea 14:2, where in calling on God for deliverance, we read that when it is accomplished, when we have had our iniquities cleansed away, our response will be to offer the calves of our lips, the KJV. The calves of our lips. This kind of shorthand, without explanation, seems to indicate a broad familiarity with this concept of our singing and our worship and our praying and our offering up of musical sacrifice as being related to the animal sacrifice. And it gives another twist on the fruit of our lips in Hebrews and other places, that this could be seen as the fruit of the womb, more than just fruits and vegetables kind of fruit. The calves of our lips. As we sing forth praise, like the God we image, our words have effect, right? He spoke, and as Peter said last year, maybe even sang the world into existence. And as we go forth, we should not consider what we're doing as not important or non-effectual, but put thought into it. We'll give account for every word. We can tear down and we can build up with our words. Words are very, very important, and sung words are very, very important. And as we give birth to our words, even if they're borrowed words, which hopefully most of them are, we give birth to a sacrifice that we then offer up to God. Now, there are many implications with this. There are just two I want to touch on, one briefly and the second at more length. First, it means we're not wasting our time here. Getting together to talk about music with all the pressing practical needs of the church, the acts of service that need to be done, the unborn babies that need to be spoken for, the doctrine creeping in wrong directions all over the place, and all kinds of things that we can really get into. Are we wasting all time and money to get together and talk about music? We already have more music than we could possibly master in a lifetime. We have a lot to rediscover. Are we just funneling resources from important matters for no reason? I recently had a guy tell me, I'm not knocking the choir, but I don't remember how well people sing being on Christ's evaluation list separating sheep and goats. However, we're a lot more successful at getting a dozen people assembled to sing songs than we are at getting them assembled to help widows and orphans. So what about it? Are we just fiddling while Rome burns? No. Any objection to this emphasis on music could also have been leveled against the offering of blood sacrifice. And I would even take exception to the just singing songs. They're assembled to sing songs. I'm not sure singing is ever just singing songs. It's always more than that. But in any case, this kind of singing is not just singing songs. Maybe instead we ought to see what we're doing as more important than we currently do, and adopt the approach of Jehoshaphat, sending the singers before the army into battle. Yuri just mentioned going into that when there's cultural transformation, singing will follow. I would maybe flip that and say, when there's cultural transformation that needs to happen, singing needs to lead the way. Singing leads the charge. If you want to help more widows and more orphans, great, so do I. So sing louder, sing more intentionally, sing more to the purpose, sing more skillfully. If our spiritual warfare is lagging in other areas, maybe some of the fault is with the uncertain trumpet playing. But second, and here's where I'm going to spend most of my time, this concept of our sacrifice being our praise, that offering to God this spiritual sacrifice of singing, also implies, and I think requires us to see it as coming under the heading then of the quality, the unequivocal demand of the law of God regarding sacrifices being without blemish, the best, the first, without defect. Leviticus 22:20. Whatever has a defect you shall not offer, for it shall not be acceptable on your behalf. Deuteronomy 17:1. You shall not sacrifice to the Lord your God a bull or sheep which has any blemish or defect, for that is an abomination to the Lord your God. So strong words. Deuteronomy 15:21. If there is a defect in it, if it is lame or blind or has any serious defect, you shall not sacrifice it to the Lord your God. So there was allowance made for poor people bringing sacrifices, for them to bring what they could. But even that wasn't, if all they had were lame sheep, then they would have to buy something, right? They would, because that cannot be offered to God. So our service of worship is to be with reverence and awe, not haphazard with lots left over, but I had just a chance to dash off real quick last night. Psalm 33 calls not just for a new song and not just for a glad song, but for skill, right? Skill in performance, skill in playing. But I think, and maybe I'll jump ahead to something I was going to say later, I'm in doing psalm versification, in setting a song to meter, I'm not actually an author, right? I'm not writing, hopefully. If I'm doing what I'm aiming to do, to be as close as I can to a translator, I'm not the one authoring the ideas or the concepts. I am, in a sense, part of the performance, right? I'm performing it. I'm trying to give the sense thereof. And this puts me into this camp that David's speaking of, that to perform it with skill, that I need to be doing it well and not just haphazardly. Malachi rebukes Israel for bringing inferior sacrifice, and their response was almost more dishonoring than anything, because their response was, what do you mean dishonor? How am I not honoring God? And it almost seems like there in Malachi 1:6-14, that he's addressing that attitude. The very act of asking, what's the big deal, reveals this low view of his glory, this low view of his honor. Now, of course, there are things to say, qualifications, allowances. It's not our singing, it's Christ who is our perfect sacrifice, once for all, the only basis for our standing before God. Absolutely. But the same could have been said of blood sacrifices pre-cross. That those were not what were your standing before God, but they're anticipating the coming Messiah. So it is now. we do not stand before God on the basis of how well we sing or what we sing, but on the basis of Christ alone. And yet, there are standards for sacrifice. So, all things taken into account, even with the allowances, I don't think we can deny that God requires us to offer the best of what is available to us, to be willing to actually have to sacrifice to produce and sing it. Unfortunately, an analysis of many hymns, and to our point, an analysis of many settings of the Psalms, even popular ones, even ones in the cantus that you love, reveals that some of the calves of our lips are quite lame. So what is the goal? And I'm changing direction a little bit. And I'm going to talk about the musical part of this and the poetry part. What is the goal? Last year I emphasized in writing metrical psalms two goals that I have: faithful translation and genuinely good poetry. And I'm going to focus on that second one. I will grant, even though I push against it, I will grant that in the end we have nothing much more than a paraphrase when you have a metrical psalm. I will grant that. But I am pushing against it, and my goal is, wouldn't it be cool if I got it done and it could be called a faithful translation? And why can't that be a goal? Why can't we set our standards there? But genuinely good poetry. I said last year the goal is luscious poetry that could be read for pleasure. And I do believe this, but in conversation since then I've realized there's a distinction to be made that I think is helpful between kinds of poetry, kinds of metrical poetry. And there are other kinds of poetry than that, of course, but sung poetry and spoken poetry, two kinds of metrical poetry. I don't know that I would acknowledge the existence of poetry written just to be read silently. Poetry is either spoken or sung. Hymns and metrical psalms are a very specific kind of poetry. They are poetry meant for singing, and specifically poetry meant for congregational singing. That's a narrowing definition, and I think it's important to consider. Orson Scott Card, my favorite sci-fi writer, also turns out to be a prolific LDS hymn writer, said that the most important rule of writing hymns is this: each stanza must exactly match all the others, accent for accent, syllable for syllable. And he doesn't say this out of his false doctrine, I don't think. And although interestingly, reading through all that he wrote, and he's written a lot, I got about halfway through, there is a lot that is out of his heretical beliefs. Interestingly, I don't know how much, if he would intentionally or if he would directly contradict everything that Yuri just said, but it was certainly very antithetical to that. It was very much determining whether a hymn was fit for worship or not. To him came down to, does it fit this sort of vague, superficial, churchy feel or not? We don't want to get too specific. We don't want to have too much fun with it. So I reject a lot of what Card had to say, but I think on this point, he is merely speaking out of his writing expertise and understanding how people work. Poems written for congregational singing work best with uniform, predictable patterns of syllables and accents. Exactly identical in every stanza, no variation. Now, we have examples of bending those rules, but when we have those exceptions, I think we have things that are a little harder to sing. They take longer to learn. It's not the ideal. Now, if you would apply this rule to spoken poetry, you'll kill it. If you make spoken poetry uniform, predictable, it can become very sing-songy and trite. Whereas with a metrical psalm, we're stuffing it into this iron armor of fixed rhyme and syllable patterns with very little wriggle room. In spoken poetry, this would produce doggerel. As poetry teacher Suzanne Clark said, it fails to surprise, fails to disturb, fails to lift any sort of veil from the world's mystery. It's more likely to sound trite or to put us to sleep, which is the opposite of what we're trying to do with poetry. So rather than regimental armor of strict rhyme and syllable patterns, in spoken poetry, it's dressed, even metrical poetry is dressed in loose-fitting robes of slant rhymes and enjambment and varied unstressed syllable count and these sorts of ways to allow the poem to breathe and to stretch and to surprise you. This keeps poetry from the trance of monotony, which allows, which gives it the power, gives the poetry the power to slip the verbal blade home between our encrusted scales of familiarity and startle us or move us, make us wider awake. And that is still what we're trying to do when we're writing hymns or metrical psalms, but we have to do it in other ways. For the sake of time, I was going to, well, maybe I will. Let me put this up here. Where is it? This is my last quote. I will try. I was just.
I see a big plus sign right there.
Yeah, this morning I was having a hard time singing and because I could not read the screen. I'm getting to that age too. So here we have, well, I'll read a little bit. Phlox lines the river trail, white, purple, and in between. And then this in between becomes a repeated idea. Twilight run, so you're between the lights. Between stream and springy soil, green and darker green. Between the shadows an aging sun, a turtle sleeping on a stone, a silver flash of silver fin, a small rain. You can see he is very much varying syllable counts. In my feet an ancient hurt betrays a fire in the heart. So there we have enjambment, where we have the thought completed in the next line instead of fitting it all into one line. We're not as free to do that in metrical psalms. A hawk blazes above the trees with burning eyes. Birches glow in a dense field, foxglove, thistle, burr, and dock, between the cold and cloudy cold, dark and more dark. And there's a lot here. I think this is there's a lot. I think it's pretty profound the more you think about it, and that's what poetry ought to be. But you have a slant rhymes there in the last. I don't know if you can see my pointer there. Field and cold aren't exactly rhymes. Dock and dark aren't exactly rhymes, but they work. And they keep you enough off balance that you see what he's doing, but it isn't distracting from what he's doing. But it's what poetry ought to be. So I think that's a great example of that. Here's one by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. The tide rises, the tide falls. The tide rises, the tide falls, the twilight darkens, the curlew calls. Along the sea sands damp and brown, the traveler hastens toward the town, and the tide rises, the tide falls. So there, he's actually making use of that sing-song quality to mimic the tide. But he's still, you can see I marked out the syllables. And he has a 7, 9, 8, 9, 8, and then 8, 10, 9, 8, 8, 9, 8, 8, 9, 8. He's loose with it. He can change it up. This wouldn't sing very well. In those areas where we're getting too many syllables in a line, part of the congregation, and I see it happen in the things that we sing with exceptions, part of the congregation drops out or goes ahead, or we get off kilter there because this is a spoken poem. It's not a sung poem. Another example of enjambment there, the day returned, the last line down here. The day returns, but nevermore returns the traveler to the shore. It's glorious. You gotta do things like this. This is a great poem. but it wouldn't work as well for being sung. To see the contrast between sung poetry and spoken poetry, take the next example, How Firm a Foundation, which I would consider one of the great hymns that's not going anywhere. How firm a foundation, you saints of the Lord, is laid for your faith in his excellent word. What more can he say than to you he has said, to you who for refuge to Jesus have fled? It doesn't work well spoken. Even when I try to speak it in a natural way, and it's in natural word order, and it's great, it starts to sound sing-songy. Your voice goes up and down, and it just starts to, which is a very monotonous and putting to sleep kind of thing. Peter's even yawning over there. That it's a wonderful hymn. As soon as you sing it, it loses all of its monotony and becomes glorious. It becomes moving. It becomes powerful and majestic. To quote Orson Scott Card again, good poems rarely make good hymns, and good hymn isn't necessarily a good poem. They're different arts, and I would say it differently than that, because they are both poems, but a good spoken poetry doesn't always make good sung poetry, and vice versa. Now, it's more complicated than that, as most things are. Rather than simply two categories with clear rules, the situation is more like a sliding scale, right? Frank Baker, author of Representative Verse of Charles Wesley, refers to the variation from the strict pattern, and there's always some variation, with the musical term modulation. And he says all who use language modulate the pattern to some degree. And I put his quote here. Hymns are a peculiar category since they are made for singing to relatively simple tunes, to which each stanza must conform. Hymn writers in general, therefore, tend to ignore or remain in ignorance of the values of modulation. Because it works best to have every line the same, and the syllable count and emphasis, the stress, where the stress falls, to be reliable and to line up with the music, hymn writers often ignore that you still need to do something to make it interesting. Slavery to the tune is one of the very important reasons for the widespread assumption that hymns cannot be poetry, an assumption based on the sometimes unrealized nature of poetry as a constantly varying compromise between the naturalness of common speech and the artificiality of strictly metrical speech. There is a constantly varying compromise. At the one extreme lies prose, and the other the hurdy-gurdy. We want them both to catch your interest, to state things in a fresh way, to draw you in and help you see something you didn't see. But the poet is much more on this side of where you don't want to end up like a hurdy-gurdy with this just repetitive sing-song sound. But we're much more toward that end, doing poetry. It's broadly true that hymns with no modulation are as unsatisfactory for reading as those with excessive or violent modulations are for singing. And that's what I tried to give you some examples of. If you have too much modulation, it doesn't work well for singing. Modulation in moderation is the motto for the hymn writer with a feeling for poetry. Modulation in moderation.
I wonder if we can get that on a t-shirt for song.
Yes. See to it. I'll buy one. So poets are always fighting dull monotony, but they're fighting it in varying ways. John Milton prefaced Paradise Lost with a vicious rejection of rhyming as the jingling sound of like endings, the invention of a barbarous age to set off wretched matter and lame meter, because he thought it got in the way of the most vivid and moving expression. He thought that even those who did it well were, quote, carried away by custom, much to their own vexation, hindrance, and constraint, to express many things otherwise and for the most part worse than else they would have expressed them. I don't agree with him, but you can see that he is doing the same thing that I'm trying to argue for, and that is to, he's on this scale. How much modulation And he wants to get rid of some of the armor of what we have to fit into and loosen it up a little bit so he has more room to express himself without having to stick to the pattern. And then we get all the way over further up the scale to E. E. Cummings, who fought the dullness by even casting off strictures of capitalization, punctuation, even spelling sometimes, in his pursuit of being more free to express. And there are poets all fit on this scale somewhere, and we may not agree with all their choices, but what I'm getting at is that's what poetry writing is. It is wrestling with that, trying to be as free and surprising and unexpected as you can be while you're in a very repetitive and predictable pattern. In sung poetry, the way that you can fight the triteness and uninspiring nature of what you're saying is not by getting rid of the iron armor of unvarying syllable count and identical accent. I do not think those are variable. They're not negotiable. But in order to do it, when you still want to stir up, you still want to jab at the heart, you still want to recast time-dulled truths, you still want to revive deadened delights, we have to do what poet Diane Ackerman calls dancing in chains. Pressed into the unvarying form dictated by the tune, we're forced to inject creativity in other ways, with grammar, with word order, with primarily vivid concrete imagery, and with writing new ones once in a while. I just think that's part of this new song, not all of what the new song was, but I think it fits into what Scripture means by a new song. This is where I would part ways with my good friends in the RPCNA. To recap, the goal is genuinely good poetry for singing. Or we could say genuinely good hymnody. This is our goal. Rhyming poetry whose syllable count and accent pattern is dictated by the music and does not vary from stanza to stanza. So to repeat from last time, the 5 main goals are a fixed meter syllable pattern, natural word order, only inverted for emphasis, not to force a rhyme, end of line rhymes, though that is one of the things we can be somewhat flexible on, although I don't want to throw them out myself. Stanzas which express a complete thought and exhibit good movement, striking memorable phrases throughout. And I think it's important to not waste any syllables, make every word pay its own weight, pay its own way, carry its own weight, and I prefer solid Anglo-Saxon words. So, I'd intended to take time and spend my entire time on opening up a psalm cold and let's do it. My children were guinea pigs on this, and as they are on a lot of things. So they're used to me going on and on and on, but it still was over 2 hours, and it was a lot of me thinking. And I realized after that experiment with demonstrating that it kind of contradicts my point anyway, because my point is you need to revise again and then revise it again and revise it again. You can't just throw it together. It isn't something that you can just dash off in a couple hours if you do it right. Pulitzer Prize winner, American poet laureate Stanley Kunitz said, "Poetry is the most difficult, the most solitary, and the most life-enhancing thing one can do in the world." And that may be overstating, but it is hard. It is hard. Okay? It is a sacrifice, but I started out by saying that. So how do we do it? Revise, revise, revise. As an example, Dylan Thomas's poem, Fern Hill, which is just outstanding, and you have to read it multiple times to really start to feel what he's saying. Reportedly took over 400 revisions to get it the way he wanted it. And that's just a poem about growing up and apples and fall and outdoors, and we're talking about the spiritual sacrifice of worship to God. This is worth that work. So what I'm going to do, because I had thought that I might do something like this last year, is I started, where is it? Oh no, sorry. Psalm 69 I started working on, and I haven't finished it. I was hoping to be done by now. I just decided to save some drafts and show you various points in the writing. So let me show you what I did first. I'll try not to be boring like I was with my children, but I took this, here's Psalm 69, and I went through and highlighted all the repeated Hebrew to try to look for patterns. And it's hard to see the colors here. They're optimized for my screen, sorry. So I tried to make note of where I could, if there were a bunch of repetitions at the beginning or end, or if there are words that end up going together. So that's what I did first. Then I got James Jordan's translation here. It's very interesting. That was very helpful to at least raise a bunch of questions that I had to then answer. And then his chiastic layout, which is the most helpful. And there's not a lot I can do with this in writing the psalm versification, but to really get inside the psalm, really understand it, see where it's going, see what the central point here is right in the middle. And I really think this is not just an imagined chiasm. Seem to see him everywhere, but this one is fascinating. So anyway, that's what I did. I have that to refer back to, just to give you an idea of that. I also had the music, synthesizer form of it.
We'll do the PDF first.
What's yeah. So then let me see if I can play it. I don't know, you'll only hear it from my computer, I think. Is that the right tune?
Yeah.
And I don't know how many times I listened to this thing over and over and over again to really figure out where are the stresses, where is something that needs to be highlighted, where is it highlighted, and what, so that I know where to put the key words. This is one reason I like to figure out what tune I'm using ahead of time. There's a hymn I'm working on right now that I actually roughed it in, totally unpoetic, but just in groups of what I want to say in each stanza, and sent them to my brother and asked him to find some tunes that fit the theme. And so, let me turn this off. So that is the soundtrack of my psalm versifications. So I think I already opened one here. Yeah. So here's my first draft. I got the color coding for the chiasm, so I could sort of see where I am, and what I want to fit in a stanza. So I got verses 1 through 3. I want to fit in the first stanza. Verse 4 is one whole stanza. And this is not anything nice yet, right? I mean, this is all the further I got this first session. And I might only spend a day or an hour, because since now that I'm working full-time, more than full-time, running a construction company to pay the bills for the 11 kids, I have maybe get up in an hour in the morning. So usually I'll get up at 5 before I get the kids up at 6:30 for Bible time. I'll work on it then. So you might get more done if you have more time for writing than I do. But this was my first session, and it's just roughed in. It doesn't rhyme. Save me, O God, I drown. The waters press my neck. And here, interesting to watch that word neck, because the word seems to mean soul. And how to say that? I sink in mire without a hold or purchase for my feet. I came to waters deep. The flood overflows my soul. I hate overflows. I'm never going to use that, but it's just to see if I can fit the concepts into the right number of syllables. I tire with crying. My throat's parched. My eye fails waiting God. So that's the first thing I do, is make sure I can fit the concepts into that pattern, and make sure that my syllabification is right. So save me, O God, I drown, because that's what we're going for. You can see here. Stress on the first and fourth. Save me, O God, I drown. All right, so that's the first one. Not a lot of change here on the second one. A lot of just some revision, some rearranging, but still I haven't gotten very far. And that's what happens. This is why it doesn't work to just open one up cold and go through it with you, because we could spend the whole hour and come up with 3 new words. Here I got a little further, down to verse 12. Let me show you what I also have open. This is always open. Rhymes. Words that rhymes with God. Everybody wants words that rhyme with God, and there aren't any new ones. There are no new ones. So you have to use slant rhymes and try to put the word God in the middle somewhere. Synonyms, and this is great. But I usually, if I'm going to do anything, I'll first go to, here's the Bible software I use. But any Bible software will help. If you can have the interlinear, and I put the New King James in there alongside of it, cross references, and then I can, I don't have Hebrew. That's my next goal. Hopefully by the time I'm 60 I can learn Hebrew. This is where I would start. So if I'm looking up for a synonym for something, if I want to see the waters have come up to my, here, nephesh. Why is it translated neck here? Anyway, very interesting. So then the first place I'll go if I'm looking for synonyms for something is obviously to the Hebrew, not just to English. But then if I've tried to flesh out or figured out what is it, what's the right translation here, then I'll go and look for synonyms for that. Just to show you my order of priority there. The etymology dictionary, because I would rather find something that's Anglo-Saxon. To check if a word is okay, I used whelm because it fit, and nobody says whelm, they say overwhelm, so I just wanted to make sure that I was right, it's actually a word. And then to remind myself of this stuff, which is pretty much useless unless you want to sound educated. I don't really use the terminology when you're doing the work. This is a long psalm, so I've got about halfway through. Here, wow. See, this is why I didn't do it. I do a lot of thinking, and I don't know what to tell you. But I'll go to the next one. Oops, that's not the next one. You can see here that I've changed it a little bit so it fits better, but I've combined these lines. Nothing is done yet, or I would have changed the color. So if it's blue, I'm still working on it. I got down to verse 22. Let's see the dates on these. So February 3rd, now we're at February 10th. Almost to the last stanza. And if you feel like this is kind of monotonous and boring, then I'm getting my point across. So now I finally got it all roughed in after, well, this is the 17th. So after 2 weeks, I got it roughed in. I'll just go to the most recent one. When I switched it, so read or undone. So these first two, I'm
Zooming in a little bit.
okay with, yes. Let me. Let me zoom out a little bit so you can see the original.
Can I ask a quick question?
If you can come up with one.
If you, in one of the earlier versions, you had water is deep. Is that the kind of violation of word order that you is suboptimal
Yeah.
in your mind?
Absolutely.
And so that's why you changed it here.
Yeah, just to get it to fit, I
Yeah.
break all the rules. You know what I mean? I would like it. Now, there are times when I've done it, and I was trying to think of some examples, but I was listening to one recently, and I realized I had inverted word order, and I liked it. It was better, because then you end up singing the key word for a long note where it belonged. We do that in speaking too, I think, so I'm okay with that. But I try to set my standards very, very high, so that if I come close, I've done okay. So, save me, O God, come save. My soul is whelmed by floods. Sinking in depths of trackless mud, I slip beneath the waves. So, save and waves is not something I would have done when I started out. Floods and mud, I would have had them both end with S, but I realize that's not important. I find no place to stand where torrents overflow. My wearied crying dries my throat, so their flow and throat are not exact rhymes, but they work. For God, my eyes are strained. So we have, 4 of those same letters in the end, and you get a very similar sound to it, so that works.
Ronald, sometimes those slant rhymes actually draw attention to the fact that you're distressed. That works particularly well in distressed lament poetry.
Good. I have amassed more foes than hairs upon my head. And frankly, this is why I've stalled on this one. I cannot find a way to say something about hairs on my head that isn't funny. It isn't supposed to be funny. But if we can go back to the first one.
Enemies now outnumber hair.
Yeah, enemies now outnumber hair I see before my eyes. Like, get a haircut. So,
How far afield do you let yourself go? Like if you took the concept of hair in the Bible and kind of like hair the crown of glory, would you go that far and say, I'm just going to talk about glory? I have more enemies than I have honor or glory.
I'll go back to some people will do that, and I'm glad you brought it up. In fact, I'm going to switch to a different psalm to illustrate the answer to that. Not very far afield at all. Somebody asked me, let's see if I can find Psalm 104. It's one I did earlier this year, and I'm not entirely happy with it because it is a summary, and I've never summarized one so much. But this is what was asked for. I think Nathan Clark George did one, and he did like 4 stanzas or something. And a church was asking me for 10 stanzas, try to get the whole psalm in 10 stanzas, which was still not enough. So I left out some stuff that is an astonishing blow. May my meditation be sweet to him, I will be glad in the Lord, didn't fit in there. That's ridiculous. Verse 32. He looks on the earth and it trembles. He touches the hills and they smoke. One of the best lines, and I couldn't fit it in this last stanza, so I'll probably revisit that. But somebody asked me about this last stanza. Let me zoom in a little bit. They sang it as a church, and somebody asked the pastor after, I'll read what he said. I'll sing praise while I endure. What if it were changed to I'll sing praise while I have breath? Well, first of all, it wouldn't work with the rhyme scheme, because I have the rhyme scheme here is A plus A. And then B. So if I change this to while I have breath, then I have to redo that whole line. But also because, here's what he said. What if we were to change it to I'll sing while I have breath? Then it would link to verse 29, take their breath, they turn to dust, which would be a neat connection. I am trying to avoid neat connections. If the psalmist didn't think it was neat enough to put in there, I'm not going to do it either. Because my goal, and there's a place for that. A mighty fortress is our God is grand, but it isn't what I'm doing. I'm trying to keep all of my commentary out and be as strict as I can. And other people can do that, but this is what I'm after, is as close to as possible. I think what he did draw attention to was not that. What he did draw attention to was something different. And why would I think that I should leave that and draw attention to what I see? Where did we go with this? Oh, here we are. While I endure, his word for living, while I have my being, is closer to this idea of enduring. It was a word for continuance, continuing, going on. So then I would leave that concept out in favor of a connection I see. And the word is important. The word breath is important in here, and he uses it. David uses it a couple times. I didn't write down where, but yeah, there is a theme here of breath. Oh, his spirit. That, in fact, I think I might have. I don't know if I wrote this one down. Let me see real quick. I don't want to waste your time. Nope. That was just email exchange. No, there was a theme of breath, and what I would like to do, and here to draw attention to what my intention is, what I think about as I do this, is one, I think of a Psalter committee, and what are they going to do? What are they going to push back on? What are they going to challenge? So I got that in my mind, because that's important. If I write a bunch of stuff and it never gets anywhere and nobody ever uses it, then it was just a good Bible study. And and the other thing I think about is this kind of feedback. I love it when I hear, there's another psalm, and I can't remember which one it was, where the congregation sang it and came and challenged it. And it was more of a home church setting. And they just said, what? What did we just say? That's not what that means. And so well, let's look at it. So they looked up the words and they said, whoa, that is what it means. Cool. That's exactly that's what I want. I want people to say, get me my Bible. I mean, what could we want more than that? And then to say, wow. Also in this one, it's another good place to talk about that, to talk about what my goal is. Here, verses 24 through 27. Lord, what diverse works you made, in your wisdom you created. Oceans teem with small and great. So we have that rhyme scheme, made, create, great. Ships sail forth where monsters play, trusting you for food each day. He said to me that somebody in the congregation just was almost in tears and so excited to sing, ships sail forth where monsters play. And that's what the psalm says. And so my goal is that they will get excited and they will see things, and then when they go back and read their Bible, they'll be even more excited when they read it in the Bible. I don't want to introduce my ideas. I assume they won't be as powerful as the originals.
I think I saw a question in the middle of the room.
I was just gonna say there's another reason why it's hard to compose something in a group with the blackboard, and that's, stuff that's written by a committee is usually not very good. So a lot of these modern songs, the credits on the modern song will have like
Everybody in the room
different
contributed to it.
and I think you wanna a single voice, the Psalms that are by David, and he has a distinct voice.
That's a good point. In fact, I thought of that this morning when I was thinking about, is it a good idea for me to be thinking, what is the Psalter committee going to, how are they going to react? So I don't want to put too much pressure on that, yeah. I do think we're running up against the clock. There's something I really wanted to get to. Couple examples. One of the important things to do in this psalm versification is what writers call killing your darlings. You have to be willing to let them go if they don't fit. If there's something you really, really like. Let me go to one of my favorites. It's not even a psalm. It's the Song of Hezekiah. And the tune is just, we've got to sing it sometime. Yeah, right? It starts out. I myself said, in the noontime of my days must I depart. To the gates of Sheol am I consigned for the rest of my years. You can see here, 4 right here that I tossed. Must I in the noon of my days depart for the gates of the grave? I never shall hold in my gaze the Lord, the one Lord who can save. And it's ugly. It rhymes. It's the right syllable pattern, but that's not what it says, and I don't like it. I said, must I go in my youth, consigned to the gates of the dead, consigned to the grave evermore. I'll not see the Lord, see the Lord. And I liked that, see the Lord, because I said, I shall not see the Lord Yah in the land of living. So you got this repetition there. That maybe makes you even uncomfortable. Why did he say it twice? Well, that's what he did, so that's what I did. I said, must I go in my youth, consigned to the grave by his hand. I said, I shall not see the Lord while young and alive in the land. I think I ended up here. I said, must I dwell at death's door, my noontide cut short by his hand. I'll not see the Lord. So that one got me. So here's another example, verses 18 and 19. How many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 versions that I tossed. Even though they rhymed, even though they write syllable pattern, they weren't good enough. They didn't get it right. Here's a good example. The dead in the pit do not bring their praise for your truth as they rot. The living shall sing. He thanks you as I do, or what? So you have to be willing to throw away stuff that you thought was really clever. We already talked about Psalm 104, an example of condensing. I think that's about it. So let me conclude. There's a lot more we could do, but I'm going to just conclude here with this. If all this sounds hard, if it sounds like a lot of work, it's because it is. But is it too hard? Is it too much of a sacrifice? If so, then consider again the example of David, the sweet psalmist of Israel, who wrote Psalm 33, calling for skillful performance. We are performers when we're doing this. It's worth it. Let us, like him, refuse to offer sacrifices that cost us nothing. The worship of God is hard. After all, the priests violate the Sabbath in their offering of sacrifice, and we are all in that priesthood now. Do not expect to avoid the work of offering musical sacrifice. Revise it again. And I think in people who are authors, who are published authors, who write books, the more books you write of prose, the more you may think, and people may put pressure on you to write psalms or to write hymns. But you may have learned in your writing of prose bad habits. You may have learned to dash it off and let someone else revise it for you, edit it for you. Or you may have learned once, twice, 3 times through is good enough editing, when you may need to do 400 revisions when you're doing poetry. So it is not the same thing. It's a lot more difficult. And I think the thing I want to leave you with if you're ever considering doing this, is to revise it again, revise it again, revise it again. Don't say it's good enough until it really, really is. That's my plea, because well-respected men who are towering intellects that I cannot measure up to are putting out mediocre stuff. We don't need any more mediocre stuff. All right, I think that about wraps it up.
Alright.
Thank you.
Do you have time for questions?
If you have time for questions, anybody,
Jared, are we good on time? Yep.
any questions? Anything else you want to look at? Wish we had time to sing some.
I would like some clarification. I may have missed this. Did you explain why every stanza needs to be exactly the same?
Because
Why would you have this unvaried meter?
because the music, because it works best for congregational singing. If there is a change, I did touch on it a little bit, and if I had an example, it would work better. Orson Scott Card gives an example.
For all the saints,
For all the
and
saints.
O Come All Ye Faithful are just about the only hymns in the hymnal that are exceptions to that, and they trip people up sometimes, particularly for all the saints.
Particularly for all the saints. I've been in congregation when that's happening, and people jump ahead or people say the syllable's wrong, and it's different from verse to verse, and then you're looking at, we're supposed to say 3 syllables on this one note, and people who are used to chanting can maybe do it a little easier, but it works best. What we're not talking about is can you have an exception. We're talking about what works best, and why. Let's just stick to what works best, and do your creativity in the way you write, in the words you use, and don't mess with the pattern, because your music really, a really, really important part of this is that our music fit the content, and that when the music pauses somewhere, it's somewhere we ought to pause, and tripping people up so they're trying to go back and see what did we just say and what should I have done is a distraction. It's needless. All good? All right.
All right.
Thank you very much.